The harsh New Mexico Territory, 1879. A widow clutches her 4 daughters beneath an overturned wagon as gunfire and war cries fill the air. 24 settlers lie dead around them. Through a crack in the wagon's wooden frame, Margaret Sullivan watches as a lone Navajo warrior, separate from the attacking Apache band, witnesses the massacre from a distant ridge. Their eyes lock for just a moment. When night falls and the attackers depart, Margaret expects him to reveal their hiding place or finish what the others started. Instead, he makes a decision that will forever alter the course of both their lives, a decision born from a tragedy in his own past that only Margaret will come to understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Sullivan never wanted to travel west. Life in Boston had been comfortable, predictable, everything a widow with 4 young daughters could want. Her husband Thomas had left them a modest inheritance and a small millinery shop that kept food on the table and coal in the stove. But when the financial panic of 1877 swept through the East like wildfire, their security vanished almost overnight. Bank failures, mortgage foreclosures, and dwindling customers forced Margaret to make an impossible choice: stay and watch her daughters slowly starve, or risk everything on the promise of a new beginning. The Arizona Territory is practically giving land away, her brother-in-law James had written. Good, fertile land with year-round growing seasons. You could start again, Maggie. The girls could thrive. Margaret had stared at that letter for weeks, tracing her fingers over the hopeful words while her daughters grew thinner. Elizabeth, her eldest at 16, had already taken to hiding portions of her own meals to give to her younger sisters. Catherine, 14, Sarah, 10, and little Rebecca, barely 7. When Elizabeth fainted in the shop one afternoon, Margaret made her decision. They sold everything except what would fit in a wagon: Thomas's pocket watch, Margaret's wedding silver, the walnut dining table that had been her mother's. The journey west would be long and dangerous, especially for a woman traveling alone with children, but the westbound settlers' caravan leaving from St. Louis offered some measure of protection. 27 wagons in all, led by Jeremiah Walsh, a former cavalry officer who'd guided 3 previous expeditions to California without losing a single soul. "You're in good hands with Walsh," the outfitter in St. Louis had assured her while selling Margaret supplies at prices that nearly emptied her purse. "Best guide in the business. Just stay close to the caravan. Follow his instructions to the letter, and you'll reach your brother-in-law's homestead by summer's end." For 6 weeks, they traveled without incident. The girls, initially terrified of leaving everything they knew, gradually warmed to the adventure. Elizabeth appointed herself assistant wagon master, learning to harness their 2 mules and repair broken wheels. Catherine discovered a talent for identifying edible plants and helped supplement their dwindling supplies. Sarah kept meticulous maps of their progress, while Rebecca charmed everyone in the caravan with her stories and songs around the evening fires. Margaret watched her daughters transform before her eyes, growing stronger and more resilient with each passing mile. Perhaps James had been right. Perhaps this journey was exactly what they needed. They were 3 days from the New Mexico border when Marcus Finley's wagon broke an axle, a simple mishap, the kind that happened weekly on the trail. Walsh called for a 2-hour stop to make repairs while the rest of the caravan circled nearby. Margaret used the opportunity to wash clothes in a shallow creek with several other women. "Shame about the delay," said Abigail Porter, a farmer's wife traveling to meet her husband, who'd gone ahead to stake their claim. "Though I suppose it's better than pushing through these hills after dark." "Mr. Walsh seems concerned," Margaret observed, noting the guide's furrowed brow as he consulted with his scouts on a nearby ridge. "Do you think there's trouble?" Abigail wrung out a shirt with strong, weathered hands. My Henry served with Walsh in the cavalry. Says he's got a sixth sense about danger. If he's worried, we probably should be too. That evening, Walsh doubled the night watch and ordered all fires extinguished earlier than usual. Margaret gathered her daughters close in their wagon. "Why can't we have a fire tonight, Mother?" Rebecca asked, her small face pinched with cold. "Mr. Walsh believes we should be cautious," Margaret answered, wrapping another blanket around her youngest daughter's shoulders. "Sometimes being careful means being a little uncomfortable." "It's the Apache, isn't it?" Elizabeth whispered after. Her sisters had fallen asleep. "I overheard the men talking. There have been raids all through this territory." Margaret placed a finger to her lips. "What Mr. Walsh chooses to do out of caution and what dangers actually exist may be very different things. Try to sleep now. We have a long day tomorrow." They departed at first light, moving quickly through the rocky terrain. Walsh sent scouts riding ahead and behind, their expressions grim as they reported back periodically. By midday, the caravan had reached a narrow pass between steep cliffs. The trail narrowed, forcing the wagons to proceed single file. "Keep moving," Walsh instructed as he rode alongside Margaret's wagon. "No stops until we reach the valley on the other side." "Is there danger?" Margaret asked directly. Walsh's weathered face revealed nothing. "There's always danger on the frontier, Mrs. Sullivan, but a moving target is harder to hit than a stationary one." They were halfway through the pass when Margaret noticed a solitary rider on the ridge above them, a Native American man astride a painted horse, watching the caravan with unnervingly still attention. Unlike the other men in the caravan who cursed or reached for rifles, Walsh merely nodded in acknowledgement of the observer. "Navajo," he said quietly to Margaret. "Not Apache. He's just watching, not hunting. Their reservation starts about 20 miles west of here." "How can you tell the difference?" Elizabeth asked. "The way he sits on his horse, the pattern on his blanket, the fact that he's not hiding his presence." Walsh adjusted his hat. "The Navajo have their own troubles with the Apache bands. If anything, his being here is a good sign, means the area might be clear of Apache raiding parties." The rider disappeared behind the ridge moments later, but Margaret couldn't shake the weight of his gaze from her thoughts. That night, they camped in a broad valley beside a generous stream. The mood in the caravan lightened considerably. Children played between the wagons, women gathered to share recipes and stories, men took turns at target practice behind a stand of cottonwoods. Walsh even allowed a proper cook fire, though he still posted twice the usual number of guards. Margaret sat, mending a tear in Sarah's dress, while her daughters waded in the shallow stream, their laughter a balm after days of tension. Across the camp, she noticed a heated discussion between Walsh and Marcus Finley, whose wagon had caused their delay the previous day. "What do you mean another day?" Finley's voice carried. "We're losing valuable time." "One more day," Walsh insisted. "I want another scout report before we cross Blackwater Canyon. It's the most dangerous stretch between here and Santa Fe." "My brother's waiting for these supplies in Silver City," Finley argued. "Every day we tarry costs me money." Other men gathered around, some nodding in agreement with Finley. Margaret wasn't surprised when Abigail Porter's husband joined the dissenters. Henry Porter had been complaining about Walsh's overcautious nature for days. "We've got 30 able men and enough firepower to hold off an army," Porter declared. "I say we push through tomorrow. Those who want to wait can catch up." Walsh's face darkened. "This caravan stays together or not at all. I won't divide our strength." "Then put it to a vote," Finley demanded. "Let the heads of each family decide." Margaret watched with growing unease as Walsh was overruled 19-8. Only the most experienced frontier families sided with the guide. The rest, eager to reach their destinations and unfamiliar with the dangers of the territory, voted to proceed immediately. Later, as Margaret tucked her daughters into their pallets for the night, Elizabeth whispered, "Mother, which way did you vote?" "I didn't," Margaret admitted. "Mr. Walsh didn't ask the women." Elizabeth frowned. "But you have opinions. You're the head of our family." "Indeed I do, and indeed I am." Margaret smoothed her daughter's hair. "And my opinion is that Mr. Walsh knows this territory better than any of us. I would have followed his recommendation." "Should we be afraid?" Margaret considered her answer carefully. "We should be alert. There's a difference." The caravan departed at dawn, cutting short their rest to make up for lost time. Walsh rode at the front, his shoulders rigid with displeasure, but committed to his duty. They made good progress through the morning, the trail wide and relatively smooth as it wound between rocky outcroppings and sparse, twisted juniper trees. Shortly after noon, they reached the edge of Blackwater Canyon, a deep gash in the earth with a swift river running through its depths. The trail descended steeply to the canyon floor before climbing the opposite side, creating a natural bottleneck that made Walsh visibly uncomfortable. "Single file," he ordered. "Keep your distances. If a wagon stumbles, we don't want a pileup." Margaret's wagon was positioned near the middle of the caravan. As they began their descent, she could see the lead wagons already reaching the canyon floor, while those behind her disappeared around bends in the switchback trail. The isolation was immediate and unsettling. "Stay sharp, Elizabeth," Margaret said as her eldest daughter handled the reins. "The mules will want to rush downhill. Don't let them." Catherine sat beside Margaret on the wagon bench, while Sarah and Rebecca rode inside among their possessions. The wagon creaked ominously as it negotiated the steep decline, every rock and rut threatening to break an axle or snap a wheel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They were halfway down when the first shots rang out, distant at first, then multiplying. Like angry hornets, screams followed, then smoke. Margaret seized the reins from Elizabeth. "Get inside the wagon," she ordered. "All of you, now!" The girls scrambled to obey as Margaret assessed their situation. The shots came from the canyon floor, where the lead wagons had already descended. Behind and above them riders, Apache warriors by their dress and weapons, appeared on the ridge, firing down at the trapped wagons on the switchbacks. Walsh's voice carried up from below. "Defensive positions, circle the wagons," but there was no room to circle on the narrow trail. Each wagon was isolated, vulnerable. Margaret made an instant decision. She wouldn't continue downward into what was clearly an ambush. Instead, she whipped the mules into a frantic turn, using a slightly wider section of trail to pivot the wagon back uphill. "Mother, what are you doing?" Elizabeth cried from inside. "Finding another way," Margaret answered grimly, urging the terrified mules upward against their instincts. They hadn't gone 20 yards when an explosion rocked the canyon. Margaret looked down to see that someone, Walsh perhaps, had detonated a powder keg, trying to create a momentary advantage against the attackers. The blast spooked their mules beyond control. They bolted sideways, tipping the wagon precariously toward the edge of the trail. Margaret felt herself falling as the wagon pitched over, tumbling down the rocky slope beside the trail rather than on it. The world spun violently, the girls' screams mingling with the crack of splintering wood. Margaret held the reins in a death grip, as if they could somehow protect her daughters from the impact that was surely coming. When the wagon finally crashed to a stop, it had come to rest upside down in a shallow ravine about 50 yards below the trail. By some miracle, the canvas cover had remained partially intact, though bent wagon hoops now formed a cage around them. One of the mules lay dead, impaled by a broken shaft. The other had broken free and vanished. Is everyone alive? Margaret gasped, tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue. Elizabeth, Catherine, Sarah, Rebecca. Through choking dust and splinters, the girls responded, bruised, terrified, but alive. Margaret thanked God silently, then assessed their situation. The overturned wagon had landed in a depression, invisible from both the trail above and the canyon floor below. Through gaps in the shattered wood and torn canvas, Margaret could see the massacre continuing. Apache warriors swarmed through the caravan, firing into wagons, setting them ablaze. Men fought desperately to protect their families. Women and children ran for cover, only to be cut down. "Don't make a sound," Margaret whispered to her daughters, gathering them into the most protected corner of their ruined wagon. Not a whisper. For hours they huddled in silence as death raged around them. The Apache were thorough in their work, checking each wagon, each body. Margaret watched through a crack as Abigail Porter was dragged screaming from her hiding place. She clamped her hand over Rebecca's mouth to stifle her youngest daughter's sob. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon in blood-red light, Margaret noticed a lone figure on horseback observing the carnage from the upper ridge. The same Navajo man they'd seen the day before. He sat motionless, separated from both the settlers and the Apache, a witness rather than a participant. Their eyes met briefly through the narrow gap in the wagon planks. Margaret felt a chill of recognition pass through her. Could he see her? Did he know they were alive down here? Would he alert the Apache to their presence? The warrior turned his horse and vanished from sight, just as darkness began to fall over the canyon. Night brought relative quiet. The Apache withdrew with their plunder, leaving behind charred wagons and scattered bodies. Margaret dared not move, uncertain if sentries remained or if the attackers would return at dawn to ensure no survivors remained. Her daughters drifted into exhausted sleep, one by one, while Margaret maintained her vigil. Shortly after midnight, she heard soft footfalls approaching their hiding place. Margaret reached for Thomas's old revolver, tucked into her skirts. She'd never fired it, but the weight of it steadied her hand. If they were discovered, she would not let her daughters be taken alive. The footsteps stopped directly beside their overturned wagon. Margaret aimed the revolver at the torn canvas. A shadow moved against the starlight. Then a quiet voice spoke in heavily accented English. "You are alive in there." Not a question. A statement. Margaret's finger tensed on the trigger. "We are armed." Silence followed. Then, "The Apache have gone north with their spoils. They believe all settlers dead. If you stay quiet, they will not return." Margaret recognized the voice somehow, though she had never heard it before. It belonged to the Navajo observer. "Why are you here?" she demanded quietly. The shadow moved, and the canvas parted slightly. In the faint moonlight, Margaret saw the warrior's face for the first time. Strong features, deep-set eyes, a single feather tied into his long black hair. He carried no visible weapon. "I am called Thomas Black Hawk," he said. "My mother was Navajo. My father was a white trader named Thomas Franklin." Margaret's breath caught at the coincidence of names. "Why are you helping us?" Black Hawk was silent for a long moment. "I have seen enough death." He extended a water skin through the opening. "Drink, then remain hidden until full daylight. I will return." Before Margaret could respond, he vanished into the darkness like a ghost. Elizabeth stirred beside her. "Mother? Who was that?" Margaret stared at the water skin in her hands, fighting against both hope and suspicion. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted, "but I think he might be our only chance of survival." Dawn broke over Blackwater Canyon, revealing the full extent of the devastation. From their hiding place beneath the overturned wagon, Margaret watched as scavengers, both bird and beast, began to descend upon the scattered remains of the caravan. The acrid smell of burned wood, gunpowder, and death hung thick in the air. "We can't stay here," Elizabeth whispered, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears. "The bodies will bring predators." Margaret nodded grimly. "We'll wait another hour. Make certain the Apache aren't watching for survivors." Catherine, always practical, had already begun taking inventory of their salvageable supplies. The food box cracked open, but most of it's still good. "We have 2 canteens plus the water skin that man gave us. Father's revolver has 4 bullets. Left?" "What about the medicine chest?" Margaret asked. Sarah, her face pale but composed, pulled the small wooden box from beneath a pile of clothing. "It wasn't damaged, but Rebecca's cough is worse." Margaret turned to her youngest daughter, who huddled beneath their only intact blanket. Rebecca's breathing came in shallow rasps, her face flushed with fever. The fall had aggravated the chronic lung weakness she'd suffered since infancy. "We need shelter," Margaret decided. "Proper rest and medicine." "Where?" Elizabeth asked. "We're at least 4 days from the nearest settlement, and that's if we had horses." Before Margaret could respond, a shadow fell across the torn canvas. The girls froze in terror, but Margaret recognized the silhouette immediately. "Thomas Blackhawk," she acknowledged, keeping her voice steady. The Navajo warrior crouched beside their hiding place. "You must come with me now," he said without preamble. "Apache scouts are returning to count their victory marks on the dead." Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding. "My youngest is sick. She can't walk far." Blackhawk's expression remained impassive. "I have brought a horse. You and the small one will ride. The others must walk. Bring only what you need to survive." Within minutes, they had gathered their most essential belongings: food, water, medicine, Margaret's sewing kit, Thomas's watch and revolver. Blackhawk led them up a nearly invisible game trail that wound away from the canyon, avoiding the main path where the Apache would return. Rebecca clung weakly to Margaret's back as they rode Blackhawk's painted mare. Elizabeth, Catherine, and Sarah followed on foot, stumbling occasionally from exhaustion and shock. No one spoke. The only sounds were the crunch of footsteps, Rebecca's, labored breathing, and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. After an hour of difficult travel, Margaret finally broke the silence. "Where are you taking us?" Blackhawk glanced back, his dark eyes unreadable. "There is a place. Hidden. Safe for—" "Why are you helping us?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice wavering between gratitude and suspicion. The warrior continued walking without looking back. "I will explain when we are safe." By midday, they had climbed high into the foothills, the canyon now a distant scar in the landscape below. Rebecca's fever had worsened, her small body burning against Margaret's back. They paused briefly by a spring to refill their water containers and dampen Rebecca's forehead. "How much farther?" Margaret asked, anxiety tightening her throat as she cradled her youngest. "Before sundown," Blackhawk replied, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "The little one needs medicine more powerful than what you carry." Sarah, who had been silent until now, approached the warrior cautiously. "Are you a medicine man?" Something like sadness flickered across Blackhawk's face. "No, but my grandmother was a healer. She taught me the plants that drive away fever." They continued their journey, the terrain growing increasingly rugged. Blackhawk led them through narrow passages between towering rocks, across dry stream beds, and beneath overhanging cliffs, a route deliberately difficult to follow. Margaret realized he was taking precautions against pursuit, creating a trail that even experienced trackers would struggle to detect. Late afternoon brought them to a hidden valley nestled between steep canyon walls. A small stream carved its way through the center, feeding a cluster of cottonwood trees. Beneath the largest tree stood a stone and timber structure, part cave, part cabin, built into the natural contour of the rock face. "My father built this place," Blackhawk explained as he helped Margaret dismount with Rebecca. "He came here to hunt, to trade, and to visit my mother when the whites would not accept their union." Inside, the dwelling was sparse but serviceable. A stone fireplace, simple wooden furnishings, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and pelts covering the packed earth floor. Black Hawk immediately set about lighting a fire and preparing a medicinal tea from plants gathered along their journey. "Your father," Margaret began hesitantly as she settled Rebecca onto a pallet of soft furs. "You said his name was Thomas?" Black Hawk nodded without looking up from his work. "Thomas Franklin. A fair man. He died when Apache raided his trading post 10 winters ago. And your mother?" A shadow passed over the warrior's features. "She returned to her people after he died. The sickness took her 2 summers later." Catherine hovered nearby, watching intently as Black Hawk prepared the herbal remedy. Always the most pragmatic of Margaret's daughters, she had overcome her initial fear of their rescuer through scientific curiosity. "What are you using for the fever?" "Willow bark," he replied, allowing her to observe. "And these purple flowers that grow by the stream, my people call them breath-bringers." When the tea was ready, Black Hawk helped Margaret lift Rebecca's head. "She must drink all of it. The taste is bitter, but the medicine is strong." Rebecca grimaced at the first sip, but obediently swallowed under her mother's encouraging gaze. Within an hour, her breathing eased and the fever began to recede. Margaret felt the first genuine relief since the attack. As darkness fell, Black Hawk prepared a simple meal of dried meat, pine nuts, and wild onions. The girls ate ravenously, the shock of survival giving way to bodily needs too long ignored. Margaret picked at her food, questions churning in her mind. After the meal, Elizabeth and Catherine took Sarah to the stream to wash away the dirt and blood of the previous day. Rebecca slept peacefully on her pallet. At last, Margaret found herself alone with their mysterious savior. "I need to understand," she said quietly, meeting his gaze across the dying fire. "You were watching when the caravan was attacked. You could have warned us." Black Hawk's face remained impassive. "I tried. I spoke to your guide the night before. I told him Apache were watching the canyon passage." Margaret's breath caught. "Walsh knew? He knew. He wanted to wait, to find another path. The others refused to listen. The pieces fell into place in Margaret's mind. Walsh's insistence on delaying, the heated argument with Finley and Porter, the guide's rigid posture as they descended into the canyon against his better judgment. "You could have been more forceful in your warning," she pressed. Black Hawk's eyes reflected the fading embers. "My words mean little to white settlers. Many see all native people as enemies. If I had approached your caravan directly, I might have been shot before speaking." Margaret looked away, unable to deny the truth in his words. "Yet you came back. You found us. Why save us and not the others?" For the first time, emotion broke through Black Hawk's stoic expression. A flash of old pain, quickly controlled. "By the time I reached the canyon floor, only death remained. Except for your wagon, I saw movement, a mother protecting her children." He paused, then added softly, "I have seen too many innocent ones die." Before Margaret could respond, the girls returned from the stream, clean but exhausted. The conversation ended as they settled in for the night, Black Hawk taking a position near the door, apart from the Sullivan family. In the dim light, Margaret studied their rescuer as he stared into the darkness beyond the dwelling. What had he seen that drove him to risk his life for strangers? What ghosts haunted his vigilance? Morning brought new challenges. Rebecca's fever had broken, but she remained weak. And while the hidden valley offered temporary sanctuary, it could not be their permanent refuge. "We need to reach Santa Fe," Margaret declared, as they shared a breakfast of dried berries and pine nuts. "My brother-in-law is expecting us in the Arizona Territory. He'll send help once he realizes we never arrived." "When would he expect you?" Black Hawk asked. "Not for another 3 weeks," Margaret admitted. "It could be a month or more before he raises an alarm." "The nearest white settlement is 4 days' hard travel," Black Hawk said. "The terrain is difficult, water scarce. With children, one of them is sick. It would be dangerous. More dangerous than staying here," Elizabeth challenged. Black Hawk studied the eldest Sullivan daughter, noting her fierce protectiveness. Perhaps not, but there is another way. He hesitated before continuing. My mother's people, the Navajo, have a trading post 3 days from here. They deal fairly with honest whites. They could provide supplies, perhaps even escorts to Santa Fe. Margaret weighed their options carefully. They had no wagon, minimal supplies, and Rebecca was still recovering. The promise of assistance, even from an unfamiliar culture, outweighed the dangers of attempting the journey alone. When could we leave? She asked. Tomorrow, Black Hawk replied. The little one needs another day of rest. I will hunt today. Prepare food for the journey. When Black Hawk departed with his bow and hunting knife, Catherine voiced the concern that had been growing among the sisters. Can we truly trust him, Mother? We know nothing about him. He saved our lives, Margaret reminded her. He cared for Rebecca when he could have left us to fend for ourselves, but he's still... Sarah trailed off, unable to articulate the cultural gulf that separated them from their rescuer. Different, Margaret finished gently. Yes, his world is not ours, but he has shown more humanity than those who attacked us. She touched the revolver tucked into her skirt. Besides, we are not entirely defenseless, while Rebecca slept and... The other girls repaired their torn clothing using Margaret's sewing kit. Margaret explored the small dwelling. On a crude shelf carved into the rock wall, she discovered a worn Bible, a tarnished silver locket, and a child's wooden toy, a small horse painted with fading colors. The locket contained a miniature portrait of a stern-faced white man with a full beard and the same deep-set eyes as Black Hawk. Beside it was a lock of black hair tied with a thread of red wool. Margaret carefully replaced these private treasures, but the glimpse into their rescuer's past deepened her curiosity. When Black Hawk returned with 2 rabbits and a string of trout, Margaret was kneading a simple dough made from ground pine, nuts, and dried berries. Their eyes met briefly in mutual recognition of the domestic partnership they had temporarily formed, an unspoken understanding beyond words or custom. That evening, as they prepared for sleep, Rebecca asked the question that had been troubling her. Mr. Black Hawk, are there other survivors from our caravan? Other children like us? The warrior's expression softened as he looked at the small girl. I found no others alive. I'm sorry. The Porters had a daughter my age, Rebecca whispered. Her name was Hannah. Black Hawk knelt beside Rebecca's pallet. In my mother's tradition, we believe those who die before their time become stars in the night sky. Perhaps your friend watches over you now. Rebecca considered this solemnly. Do you think she's afraid, being up there alone? No, Black Hawk said gently. The sky people are never alone. They travel together, telling stories across the heavens. Later, when the girls slept, Margaret found Black Hawk outside, gazing at the star-filled sky. Thank you, she said simply, for what you told Rebecca. It was not merely comfort, he replied. It is what my people believe. And what do you believe? Margaret asked. With a father who read the Bible and a mother who saw ancestors in the stars? Black Hawk was silent for a long moment. I believe there are many paths to the same mountain peak. My father's God and my mother's spirits may be different faces of the same truth. Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter against the night chill. When the Apache attacked, you spoke of having seen too many innocent ones die. What did you mean? The question hung between them, weightier than mere words. Black Hawk's face remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes. A door opening onto old wounds. 5 winters ago, he began, his voice low. I had a wife, Kiona, and a daughter, Ayasha. They were visiting Kiona's family at a settlement near the border of Apache territory when a conflict erupted between settlers and an Apache hunting party. The soldiers who came did not distinguish between Apache and Navajo. They fired upon all native people in the area, He paused, composure momentarily fracturing. My wife and daughter were among those killed, not by Apache, not by sickness or accident, by men who saw only their skin, not their innocence. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered, the inadequacy of the words burning in her throat. When I saw you in the canyon, Black Hawk continued, a mother shielding her children, I saw what might have been, what should have been. I could not watch it happen again. The revelation settled between them, the true reason for their rescue, the bond of shared loss that transcended their differences. Margaret found herself reaching out, her hand coming to rest lightly on his forearm. Thomas, she said, using his given name for the first time, your wife and daughter would be proud of what you did for us. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a recognition, a possibility neither was ready to acknowledge. Black Hawk gently withdrew his arm. We should rest, he said. Tomorrow's journey will test us all. Dawn brought clear skies and cooler temperatures, favorable conditions for travel. Rebecca's strength had improved enough for her to walk short distances, though Black Hawk insisted she ride the horse when she tired. They departed the hidden valley as the sun crested the eastern mountains, following a different path than the one that had brought them there. This route is longer but safer, Black Hawk explained. We will follow the high ridges where we can see anyone approaching. The day passed in careful progress through rugged terrain. Black Hawk moved with the instinctive grace of one born to the landscape, occasionally pointing out landmarks or plants of significance. The Sullivan women, though still weakened by their ordeal, found unexpected reserves of determination. Even Sarah, who had always been considered delicate, scrambled over rocks and forded shallow streams without complaint. By midday, they had covered considerable ground. During their brief rest, Catherine approached Black Hawk with tentative curiosity. How? Do you navigate without a compass? She asked. There are no marked trails here. The land speaks to those who listen, he replied, pointing to subtle signs Catherine had overlooked. The pattern of lichen on rocks indicating north, the specific tilt of certain plants following the sun's path, the distant profile of mountains, providing consistent reference points. Catherine absorbed the lesson with growing respect. Our father used to say that knowledge comes in many forms. I think he would have appreciated yours. Black Hawk acknowledged this with a slight nod. And I would have respected his. My father taught me to read the white man's books alongside. My mother's teachings about the natural world both have value. They resumed their journey, the mutual wariness between the Sullivans and their guide gradually giving way to cautious rapport. Elizabeth and Black Hawk scouted ahead, her natural leadership complementing his wilderness experience. Catherine continued her impromptu study of native plants, mentally cataloguing their properties. Sarah mapped their progress on a scrap of paper, creating her own system of symbols for landmarks. Only Margaret remained somewhat distant, her thoughts constantly shifting between gratitude for their rescue and anxiety about their uncertain future. The weight of her family's survival pressed upon her like a physical burden. As twilight approached, Black Hawk led them to a protected hollow beneath an overhanging cliff. We will camp here tonight, he announced. There is water nearby, and the rock will hide our fire from distant eyes. While the girls gathered firewood and prepared their simple meal, Margaret stood at the edge of their campsite, gazing westward toward the fading light. Somewhere in that direction lay her brother-in-law's homestead, the promise of security that had driven them from Boston into this wilderness. She felt Black Hawk's presence before he spoke. You are troubled. Margaret didn't turn. I've led my daughters into disaster. Everything we owned is destroyed. Even if we reach Santa Fe, I have nothing left to build a new life. You have what matters most, Black Hawk said quietly. Your daughters live. You live. The rest is just things. Things. That meant security, Margaret countered. Things that meant we wouldn't starve or freeze when winter comes. Black Hawk moved to stand beside her, his gaze following hers toward the horizon. When my wife and daughter died, I abandoned my father's trading post. I lived in the mountains, alone for nearly 2 years, hunting only what I needed, speaking to no one. I thought I had lost everything worth living for. Margaret turned to study his profile, sharp against the darkening sky. What changed? An elder from my mother's people found me. He said, "The dead are not honored by throwing away the life they would have cherished." It was many months before I understood his wisdom. Black Hawk looked directly at Margaret. "Your daughters need you to believe in tomorrow, even when it seems impossible." The simplicity and truth of his words penetrated Margaret's despair. Whatever uncertainties lay ahead, she still had her girls. They still had each other. It would have to be enough. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars emerged in brilliant profusion, Margaret felt a subtle shift within herself. Not hope exactly, but perhaps its precursor. The recognition that survival itself was a kind of triumph. She didn't realize that Black Hawk watched her from across the fire, seeing in her resilience a mirror of his own painful journey from devastation to tentative renewal. Neither spoke of what passed between them in those quiet moments. Neither needed to. The unspoken understanding would carry them through the dangerous days ahead, days that would test not only their survival skills, but the fragile trust forming between two people from worlds that had rarely found common ground without bloodshed. As Margaret finally drifted to sleep, her last conscious thought was a question without an answer. When they reached safety, what would become of the man who had saved them? And why did the question trouble her heart so deeply? The second day of their journey brought new challenges. By mid-morning, dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, threatening the first significant rainfall in months. Black Hawk studied the approaching storm with concern. "We must find shelter before it breaks," he told Margaret as they paused atop a ridge. "Desert rains can be dangerous. Flash floods come without warning." Elizabeth shaded her eyes against the sun. "There's nothing but open country ahead." "There are caves in the red cliffs." Black Hawk pointed to a distant formation. "We can reach them before the storm if we hurry." They quickened their pace, Rebecca now riding on Black Hawk's shoulders to spare the horse for their supplies. The temperature dropped precipitously as the storm clouds advanced, casting the landscape in premature twilight. Thunder rumbled across the plains, startling a herd of pronghorn antelope into flight. "It's coming faster than I expected," Black Hawk admitted, his usual confidence wavering. The first fat raindrop struck as they reached the base of the red cliffs. Within moments, the gentle patter transformed into a violent downpour. Water streamed down the rock face and pooled at their feet, quickly rising. "There!" Sarah shouted, pointing to a dark opening halfway up the cliff face. "A cave!" Black Hawk assessed the steep climb. "The path will be slippery." He handed Rebecca to Margaret. "I'll go first with a rope. The rest of you follow only when I signal." Using his hunting knife to gain purchase in the softening clay, Black Hawk scaled the cliff face with practiced efficiency. Upon reaching the cave entrance, he secured a rope and lowered it for the others. Elizabeth went next, followed by Catherine, then Sarah. Margaret came last, with Rebecca clinging to her back. The rain intensified, making each handhold treacherous. Halfway up, Margaret's foot slipped on the slick clay. She swung outward, dangling momentarily over the rapidly filling wash below. "Hold on!" Black Hawk shouted, already descending to assist. Before he could reach her, Elizabeth and Catherine pulled frantically on the rope from above. Their combined efforts stabilized Margaret long enough for her to regain her footing. With a final desperate lunge, she reached the cave entrance, where Black Hawk's strong hands pulled her and Rebecca to safety. They collapsed inside, soaked and gasping, as lightning split the sky outside. The storm's fury seemed to mock their narrow escape, winds howling through the canyon like vengeful spirits. "That was too close," Margaret whispered, holding Rebecca tightly against her. "Thank you, all of you, Black Hawk moved deeper into the cave, using a small torch fashioned from resinous wood to light their surroundings. The cave extended farther than expected, opening into a series of chambers. Ancient handprints decorated the walls alongside. Faded pictographs of animals and hunters. "This place is old," he said with quiet reverence. "My people's ancestors sheltered here long before the Spanish came." Catherine approached the wall paintings, fascinated. "Who made these?" "The ancient ones, those who built the cliff cities to the north." Black Hawk touched one of the handprints gently. "They vanished centuries ago, but their spirit remains in places like this. While the storm raged outside, they made camp in the cave's inner chamber. Using wood that previous travelers had stored, Black Hawk built a small fire that cast dancing shadows across the ancient artwork. The girls huddled near its warmth, their wet clothing steaming gently. "Will the storm delay us long?" Margaret asked, conscious of Rebecca's lingering weakness and their dwindling supplies. "A day, perhaps," Black Hawk replied. "The washes will be dangerous to cross until the water recedes." As the afternoon faded into evening, Sarah discovered a natural cistern in the cave's depths, a deep pool of fresh water collected from centuries of seepage through the porous sandstone. This unexpected blessing allowed them to refill their containers and even wash away the worst of the trail's grime. That night, their enforced shelter created a moment of peace amid their desperate journey. Rebecca's breathing had improved enough for her to join in when Sarah began singing softly, a lullaby their father had taught them in what now seemed like another lifetime. After the girls fell asleep, Margaret found Black Hawk standing at the cave entrance, watching the storm's fury gradually subside. Lightning still flickers occasionally, illuminating his profile in stark relief against the darkness. "I keep thinking about what you said yesterday," Margaret began, coming to stand beside him. "About your wife and daughter." Black Hawk remained silent, but his posture acknowledged her presence. "I lost my husband 3 years ago to pneumonia," she continued. "It was peaceful. He simply didn't wake one morning. I've often thought that was a mercy compared to—" She faltered, unable to articulate the violence they had witnessed. "Compared to watching him die at another's hand," Black Hawk finished. "Yes, there is a difference. Does it ever fade?" Margaret asked. "The anger?" Black Hawk considered this carefully. "Not fade, transform. Like water over stone. It shapes you differently with time." "I'm not sure I want to be reshaped," Margaret admitted. "I'm afraid of what I might become." "We don't choose whether life changes us," he replied, "only how we meet that change." They stood together in companionable silence until the last rumbles of thunder faded into the distance. Before returning to her sleeping daughters, Margaret spoke once more. "Thomas," she said softly, "I'm glad it was you who found us." Dawn revealed a transformed landscape. The previously dusty terrain had erupted into vibrant life overnight, dormant seeds awakening, desert flowers unfurling, small creatures emerging. From burrows to drink from temporary pools. The air smelled of wet earth and sage. Black Hawk studied the terrain with experienced eyes. "The main washes will be impassable until midday. We should remain here until then." The unexpected respite allowed them to thoroughly dry their clothing and belongings. While Black Hawk hunted along the cliff base, bringing back 2 rabbits and a clutch of quail eggs, Margaret led the girls in taking inventory of their remaining supplies. "We have enough food for 3 days if we're careful," Elizabeth calculated. "The medicine is holding out, and Rebecca seems stronger today." Rebecca, eager to prove her recovery, had appointed herself guardian of their small campfire. "Mr. Black Hawk said we'll reach his people's trading post tomorrow if the ground dries enough to travel." "And then what, Mother?" Catherine asked quietly, voicing the question that had been troubling them all. "Even if we reach Santa Fe, how will we ever get to Uncle James in Arizona?" Margaret smoothed her daughter's tangled hair. One step at a time. First we survive, then we reach safety. The rest will follow. By early afternoon, the landscape had dried sufficiently for travel. Black Hawk guided them along the higher ridges, avoiding the still swollen stream beds. The desert's brief flowering made their journey almost pleasant, the harsh terrain softened by patches of wildflowers and the calls of birds that had appeared seemingly from nowhere. "It's like the world is celebrating," Sarah observed, her artistic nature responding to the transformation around them. "The desert never truly sleeps," Black Hawk explained. "It waits, patient as stone, for these moments of renewal." They made good progress throughout the afternoon, the storm freshened air energizing them despite their fatigue. By evening, Black Hawk pointed to a distant mesa outlined against the setting sun. "Beyond that lies the trading post," he told them. "We will reach it by midday tomorrow." That night, as they camped beneath a solitary juniper tree, Margaret noticed a subtle shift in Black Hawk's demeanor, a growing tension in his shoulders, a watchfulness beyond his usual vigilance. "Is something wrong?" she asked when the girls had retired. Black Hawk hesitated before answering. "We are approaching the boundary between worlds. My reception among my mother's people has not always been welcoming. My father's blood makes me suspect in some eyes." "You're concerned about how they'll receive us," Margaret realized. "The trading post deals with white settlers regularly," he assured her. "But bringing you directly after the Apache attack, some will question my judgment." "We could find another way," Margaret offered, though she knew their options were limited. Black Hawk shook his head. "This is still the safest path for you. I merely want you prepared. Stay close tomorrow. Let me speak first." The following morning brought clear skies and warming temperatures, perfect traveling conditions. They departed early, following a faint trail that wound through a landscape of twisted junipers and volcanic rock formations. By mid-morning, they detected the first signs of human presence. A carefully stacked pile of stones marking a boundary, then brief glimpses of distant shepherds with flocks of sheep and goats on the hillsides. "We are on Navajo land now," Black Hawk informed them. "Those men have already seen us. Word will reach the trading post before we arrive." As predicted, they approached the mesa by midday. The trading post occupied a natural alcove at its base, a collection of log structures and traditional hogans arranged around a central courtyard. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and horses grazed in a nearby corral. Before they could approach, 6 mounted warriors appeared from behind a rocky outcropping, forming a barrier across their path. The leader, a powerfully built man with silver, streaking his black hair, addressed Black Hawk sharply in the Navajo language. Margaret felt her daughters press closer to her as the tense exchange continued. Though she couldn't understand the words, the confrontational tone was unmistakable. Black Hawk remained composed, responding with quiet dignity despite the other man's increasing agitation. Finally, the leader turned his attention to Margaret, switching to heavily accented English. "I am River Walker, headman of this post. Why do you bring these whites here, Thomas Black Hawk? Apache raid white wagons 3 days ago. Many dead. Some say you were there." "I was," Black Hawk confirmed. "These 5 survived. The mother protected her daughters when all others perished. I could not leave them to die." River Walker's dark eyes assessed Margaret with open suspicion. "And you trust this half-blood to guide you, white woman?" Margaret straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "With my life and my daughters' lives, he has shown us nothing but honor and kindness when he could have left us to die." An older woman emerged from the largest hogan, her silver hair bound in a traditional knot, her face deeply lined by sun and time. She approached with unhurried dignity, studying the Sullivan women with piercing eyes. "These children have known hunger and fear," she stated, rather than asked. Her English flowed more smoothly than River Walker's. "The small one has been sick." "Yes, grandmother. Black Hawk confirmed respectfully. I used the medicine you taught me for her fever. The old woman nodded once, then turned to River Walker. They will stay in my dwelling tonight. The trading can be discussed after they have rested and eaten. River Walker frowned, but offered no argument. The old woman, whom Black Hawk later identified as Morning Star, a respected elder and healer, led the Sullivans to her home, a spacious hogan with a central fire pit and neatly arranged sleeping platforms around its circular perimeter. My grandson has a good heart, she told Margaret, as she served them a hearty stew of corn, beans, and rabbit. But the path between our worlds is dangerous for those with feet in both. Your grandson? Margaret asked, surprised. Morning Stars. Weathered face softened slightly. My daughter was his mother. She chose a white trader against my counsel, but he proved a better man than most. Thomas carries both their spirits. Throughout the afternoon, the Sullivan girls gradually relaxed under Morning Star's grandmotherly attention. She showed Sarah how to grind corn using a traditional stone metate, helped Catherine identify medicinal plants growing near the hogan, and delighted Rebecca with stories of Coyote, the trickster figure in Navajo mythology. Even Elizabeth, initially the most wary, found herself assisting the elder with weaving preparations, learning the patterns that would eventually become a blanket. Meanwhile, Black Hawk conferred with River Walker and other community leaders in the trading post's main building. Through the open doorway, Margaret occasionally glimpsed their serious expressions and animated gestures. The fate of her family, she realized, was being debated by people whose language she didn't understand, whose customs remained mysterious. As sunset approached, Black Hawk finally emerged from the discussion. He found Margaret sitting outside Morning Star's hogan, watching Rebecca play with several Navajo children who had overcome their initial shyness. They have agreed to help, he told her without preamble. A supply wagon leaves for Santa Fe in 2 days. The trader who owns it will take you for a price. What price? Margaret asked cautiously. We lost everything in the attack. Black Hawk's expression remained neutral. I have arranged payment. Before Margaret could press for details, Morning Star called them for the evening meal. Inside the hogan, the atmosphere had transformed. River Walker and several other community members joined them, the earlier hostility replaced by cautious civility. A young man brought out a guitar, a European instrument adapted to native music, and played soft melodies as they ate. After dinner, River Walker addressed Margaret directly. Black Hawk tells us you seek your brother's home in Arizona territory. Yes, Margaret confirmed. James Sullivan. He has a homestead near Prescott. River Walker nodded. We know this place. Many whites settle there now. He exchanged glances with Morning Star before continuing. The trader Wilson will take you to Santa Fe. From there, the army sends regular patrols to Prescott. You can arrange passage. Thank you, Margaret said sincerely. Your help means everything to us. It is not given without condition, River Walker cautioned. What happened at Blackwater Canyon will bring soldiers. They will ask questions, seek vengeance. When you reach Santa Fe, what will you tell them? Of us? Of Black Hawk? The question hung in the air, weighted with implications Margaret immediately understood. The military would want someone to blame for the massacre. To many white authorities, one Native American looked much like another. Black Hawk's presence near the attack could easily be misinterpreted or deliberately misconstrued by those seeking any excuse for retaliation. I will tell them the truth, Margaret stated firmly, that the Apache were responsible for the attack and that a Navajo man named Thomas Black Hawk saved our lives at great personal risk. Without him, 5 more graves would have been dug at Blackwater Canyon. River Walker studied her intently, searching for any hint of deception. Finding none, he nodded once. Then we have understanding. Later that night, after the visitors had departed and her daughters slept soundly for the first time in days, Margaret slipped outside to clear her thoughts. The trading post was peaceful under the vast canopy of stars, most dwellings dark, except for the main building where a lamp still burned. She found Black Hawk sitting alone outside, carving a small piece of wood with his hunting knife. Without speaking, Margaret sat beside him on the rough-hewn bench. "What did you trade for our passage to Santa Fe?" she asked after a comfortable silence. Black Hawk's hands stilled. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," Margaret insisted gently. He sighed, setting aside his carving. "My father's gold watch, and my horse." Margaret's breath caught. "Thomas, no. Those are your only valuables. They are just things," he echoed his earlier words to her. "Your lives are worth more." "Why would you make such a sacrifice for strangers?" Margaret pressed, needing to understand. Black Hawk turned to face her directly, his dark eyes reflecting starlight. "Are we still strangers, Margaret Sullivan?" The question penetrated her carefully maintained composure. No, they weren't strangers anymore. In the space of 3 days, this man had transformed from a mysterious observer to their rescuer, their guide, and now, something else she couldn't quite define. "No," she admitted softly, "not strangers, but I still don't understand why you would give up so much." Black Hawk resumed his carving, the knife moving in sure, practiced strokes. "When my wife and daughter died, I thought nothing remained for me in this world. I existed without purpose. Then I found 5 lives I could save." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Perhaps in saving you, I also saved myself." Margaret watched his hands shape the wood, gradually revealing the form of a small horse. She recognized it as a gift for Rebecca, who had been admiring the painted ponies in the trading post corral. "What will you do after we reach Santa Fe?" she asked. "Return here, continue as before." He shrugged slightly. "My grandmother needs me, especially now that her sight dims with age. Will you ever visit the white settlements again?" The question emerged before Margaret could reconsider its implications. Black Hawk glanced at her, something unspoken passing between them. Perhaps, if there was reason enough. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibilities neither dared articulate. Finally, Black Hawk handed her the finished carving. A perfect miniature horse, its lines flowing and graceful despite the simplicity of his tools. "For Rebecca," he said, "to remember her journey." "She won't need a carving to remember you," Margaret replied softly. "None of us will." She returned to Morningstar's Hogan with the wooden horse clutched in her hand, her thoughts in turmoil. Tomorrow they would prepare for the journey to Santa Fe, another step toward the security she had sought for her daughters. Yet for the first time since leaving Boston, Margaret found herself reluctant to continue their westward journey. As she settled onto her sleeping mat, Margaret acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. In the midst of tragedy and survival, she had formed a connection she never expected, with a man whose world was separated from hers by boundaries far more imposing than mere distance. 2 paths diverged before her, forward to her brother-in-law's homestead and the promise of conventional security, or into uncharted territory where nothing was certain except the pull of a connection she couldn't explain but couldn't deny. Morning would bring practical concerns and preparations for their journey. But tonight, beneath a shared canopy of stars, Margaret allowed herself to wonder about roads not taken and the cost of crossing boundaries both seen and unseen. Dawn at the trading post brought a flurry of activity. Wilson, the trader who would take the Sullivans to Santa Fe, arrived with his wagon, a sturdy vehicle drawn by 4 mules and loaded with wool blankets, silver jewelry, and tanned hides bound for eastern markets. A burly man with a sun-reddened face partially hidden beneath a graying beard, he inspected his new passengers with business-like efficiency. 2 days to Santa Fe if the weather holds, he informed Margaret. You and the little one can ride in the wagon. The older girls will need to walk alongside. We're accustomed to walking, Elizabeth assured him, her protective instincts flaring at his brusque manner. Wilson nodded curtly. We leave in 2 hours. Be ready. As the Sullivans gathered their meager possessions, Morning Star appeared with bundles of food and several tightly woven blankets. The nights are cold on the mesa, she explained, pressing the gifts into Margaret's hands. These will keep your daughters warm. Your generosity overwhelms me, Margaret said sincerely. How can I repay such kindness? The elder woman's weathered face softened, by remembering that goodness exists in all peoples, even when the world tells you otherwise. She glanced meaningfully toward Black Hawk, who was helping Wilson secure my cargo in the wagon. My grandson walks between worlds, belonging fully to neither. It is a lonely path. Margaret followed her gaze. He's an extraordinary man. Yes, Morningstar agreed, like his father before him. She studied Margaret with perceptive eyes. The journey ahead has many branches, daughter of the East. Choose your path with both heart and mind. Before Margaret could respond to this cryptic advice, Rebecca rushed over, clutching the wooden horse Black Hawk had carved. Grandmother Morningstar, look what Mr. Black Hawk made for me. The elder smiled, running her fingers over the carving. He has his father's skill with a knife. Thomas Franklin could make wood speak. She knelt to Rebecca's level. This is a special gift. The horse spirit brings freedom and carries prayers between earth and sky. Rebecca nodded solemnly. I'll keep it forever. As departure time approached, River Walker presented Margaret with a small pouch of coffee beans and dried meat. For the journey, he explained, his earlier suspicion replaced by grudging respect. Wilson knows the safe routes, but watch the sky. Storms come quickly this season. Thank you for sheltering us, Margaret replied. Your people have shown us kindness when we needed it most. Riverwalker's expression remained impassive. Black Hawk vouched for you. His word carries weight despite... He left the sentence unfinished, but Margaret understood the implications. Despite his mixed blood, despite the prejudices that existed on both sides of the cultural divide. I won't forget what he did for us, she assured him, what all of you have done. As Wilson made final preparations, Black Hawk approached Margaret and her daughters. He carried a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. For your journey, he said, presenting it to Margaret, and for what comes after. She unwrapped the package to find a beautifully crafted knife with a bone handle and a leather sheath decorated with intricate beadwork. Thomas, I can't accept this. You've given too much already. The knife was my father's, he explained. A white woman alone needs protection. The blade will serve you well if you respect its power. The gift's significance wasn't lost on Margaret. This wasn't merely a tool, but a symbol of trust, an heirloom passed to her safekeeping. I'll treasure it, she promised, securing the sheath to her belt. Elizabeth stepped forward, extending her hand formally. Thank you, Mr. Black Hawk. We wouldn't have survived without you. Black Hawk clasped her hand in the white man's customary greeting, honoring her emerging adulthood. You have your mother's strength, Elizabeth Sullivan. Remember it when challenges come. Catherine, typically reserved with strangers, surprised everyone by impulsively embracing him. I'll practice identifying the healing plants you showed me, she promised. Sarah presented him with a small sketch she'd made of the trading post, her artistic talent capturing the settlement's unique character with remarkable accuracy. So you won't forget us, she explained shyly. Impossible, Black Hawk assured her, carefully tucking the drawing into his shirt. Rebecca, holding back tears, clutched her wooden horse. Will we ever see you again? Black Hawk knelt to her level. The future is unwritten, little one, but I will think of you when the stars appear each night. Finally, he turned to Margaret. Their eyes met, holding a conversation too complex for words. All the unspoken possibilities, the paths not taken, the boundaries uncrossed, everything hovered between them in that momentary silence. "Safe journey, Margaret Sullivan," he said simply. "Thank you for our lives," she responded, her voice steady. Despite the emotion tightening her throat, Wilson called impatiently from the wagon. "Daylight's wasting. We need to make 10 Mile Creek by nightfall." With final embraces for Morning Star and reluctant waves to the gathered community members, the Sullivan family climbed aboard Wilson's wagon. As they departed, Margaret looked back to see Black Hawk standing beside his grandmother, his tall figure gradually diminishing with distance, but remaining visible long after the trading post had faded from view. The journey to Santa Fe proceeded much as Wilson had predicted. They traveled steadily throughout the day, stopping only briefly to rest the mules and take simple meals of jerky and hardtack. The trader proved knowledgeable, if uncommunicative, choosing routes that avoided the worst terrain while remaining vigilant for any sign of threat. By nightfall, they reached a small creek where several cottonwood trees provided natural shelter. Wilson efficiently established camp, building a small fire and preparing a more substantial meal of beans and salt pork. Though not unfriendly, he maintained a professional distance, clearly viewing the Sullivans as cargo rather than companions. As they settled around the fire, Catherine broached the subject they'd all been avoiding. "Do you travel often between the Navajo lands and Santa Fe, Mr. Wilson?" The trader nodded, stoking the fire. "Every few weeks. Trade goods out, native crafts back. Been doing this route for 15 years. Then you must know Thomas Black Hawk." "Well," she continued cautiously. Wilson's expression shifted subtly. "Known him since he was a boy running around his father's trading post. Tom Franklin was a good man, fair trader, respected by whites and Navajo alike." He poked at the fire. "The son inherited his father's decency, though it's done him few favors." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth asked. Wilson sighed, glancing at Margaret as if assessing how frank he should be. "Mixed blood's a heavy burden in these territories. Whites don't trust him because he's half Navajo. Some Navajo don't accept him because of his white father. Man without a country, so to speak. Yet he risked everything to help us," Margaret observed. "That's his father in him," Wilson replied. "Tom Franklin never could ignore folks in trouble, even when helping brought him grief." He studied Margaret with newfound interest. "Black Hawk trading his father's watch and his horse for your passage. That's significant. Those were his only connections to his past." Margaret felt her daughter's eyes upon her, questions forming that she wasn't prepared to answer. "We're grateful for his sacrifice," she said simply. Wilson seemed about to comment further, but instead turned the conversation to practical matters. "Santa Fe's grown considerably since the railroad came through. Army maintains a strong presence. You'll want to report the massacre immediately. They'll investigate, maybe send an escort when you're ready to continue to Arizona." Later, as her daughters slept beneath Morning Star's blankets, Margaret sat alone by the dying fire. The knife Black Hawk had given her rested heavily against her hip, a tangible reminder of the man who had saved them, a man walking between worlds, belonging fully to neither, as his grandmother had described. For the first time since the attack, Margaret allowed herself to fully consider her situation. Her dreams of a secure future on her brother-in-law's homestead remained viable. James would welcome them, help them establish a new life. The practical path forward was clear, yet something had shifted within her during those days of danger and survival. She had discovered reserves of strength and independence she hadn't known she possessed. The woman who had left Boston seeking security was not the same woman now contemplating her future beneath a New Mexico sky. And then there was Black Hawk, a man whose quiet dignity and profound integrity had affected her in ways she couldn't easily dismiss. Their connection had formed amid the crisis, yet it felt more substantial than mere gratitude. What might have developed between them under different circumstances? What might still develop if she chose an unexpected path? Margaret touched the knife at her belt, remembering Black Hawk's words. A white woman alone needs protection. But she wasn't entirely alone. She had her daughters, whose resilience through their ordeal had astonished her. Perhaps they were stronger together than she had realized. When sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's dreams were filled with diverging trails and choices hovering just beyond her reach. They arrived in Santa Fe late the following afternoon. The sea, territorial capital, bustled with activity, merchants hawking goods from crowded stalls, soldiers in blue uniforms patrolling the streets, wagon trains preparing for journeys east and west. After the isolation of their journey, the noise and crowds felt overwhelming to the Sullivan women. Wilson guided them directly to the military headquarters, a sturdy adobe building flying the American flag. "Captain Miller's a fair man," he told Margaret. "He'll want a full account of the massacre. Tell him everything, but—" He hesitated. "But?" Margaret prompted. "Just remember that army officers sometimes paint all natives with the same brush," Wilson cautioned. "Be clear about who helped you and who didn't." Inside, they were received by Captain James Miller, a trim officer whose youthful face contrasted. With eyes that had witnessed too much frontier violence, he listened intently as Margaret recounted the Apache attack, the death of their fellow travelers, and their rescue by Thomas Black Hawk. "You're extraordinarily fortunate, Mrs. Sullivan," Miller commented when she finished. "Few survive such encounters." "It wasn't fortune, Captain," Margaret corrected firmly. "It was the courage and kindness of a man who risked his own safety to save us." Miller nodded, making notes in a leather-bound ledger. "We've heard reports of Apache raiding parties targeting wagon trains. This fits their pattern." He looked up. "You're certain it was Apache, not Navajo or Comanche?" "Absolutely certain," Margaret stated, remembering her promise to River Walker. "The Navajo at the trading post treated us with nothing but kindness. Without Thomas Black Hawk and his people, we wouldn't have survived." The captain studied her thoughtfully. "Your account will be officially recorded. We'll dispatch a patrol to Blackwater Canyon to assess the situation and recover any remains, for proper burial." He closed his ledger. "As for your immediate needs, there's a boarding house run by Mrs. Fletcher that accepts women in difficult circumstances. I'll arrange accommodation for you and your daughters until you decide your next steps." "Thank you, Captain," Margaret replied. "I also need to send word to my brother-in-law in Prescott, James Sullivan. He's expecting us." Of course, the military courier leaves for Arizona Territory twice weekly. "I'll ensure your message is included." Miller hesitated. "Mrs. Sullivan, if you're still intent on reaching Prescott, the Army sends supply wagons that route monthly. The next one departs in 2 weeks. It would be the safest option for your family." 2 weeks, Margaret repeated, an unexpected wave of relief washing over her. 2 weeks to rest, to recover, to decide. Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house proved a sanctuary after their ordeal. The motherly widow provided clean rooms, regular meals, and practical assistance acquiring essential supplies. Within days, the Sullivan women had new clothing, proper baths, and the beginning of routine after weeks of uncertainty. The boarding house's other residents, mostly wives of soldiers stationed at distant outposts or women awaiting transportation to homesteads further west, welcomed them with frontier hospitality. Their shared circumstances created instant camaraderie, and Margaret found unexpected comfort in these female friendships after so much isolation. Elizabeth quickly assumed a role helping Mrs. Fletcher manage the boarding house operations, her natural leadership blossoming in this structured environment. Catherine discovered Santa Fe's apothecary shop and spent hours discussing medicinal plants with its elderly proprietor, comparing his knowledge with what she'd learned from Black Hawk. Sarah sketched the adobe buildings and vibrant market scenes, while Rebecca charmed everyone with her resilience and the wooden horse she proudly displayed to anyone who showed interest. A week into their stay, Margaret received a reply from her brother-in-law. James expressed horror at their ordeal and profound relief at their survival. His letter urged them to continue to Prescott as soon as practical, promising a home and security upon their arrival. "We still have a week before the army supply wagon departs," Elizabeth noted as they discussed the letter over breakfast. "Time enough to prepare properly." "Yes," Margaret agreed absently, her thoughts elsewhere. Later that day, as they walked through Santa Fe's Central Plaza, Rebecca tugged at Margaret's sleeve. "Mother, will Mr. Blackhawk ever visit us in Arizona?" The innocent question crystallized the uncertainty that had been growing in Margaret's mind. "I don't know, sweetheart. His home is with his people." "But we're his people too, aren't we?" Rebecca persisted with a child's simple logic. "He saved us. That makes us family." Out of the mouths of babes, Margaret thought. She had no answer that would satisfy her youngest daughter, or herself. That evening, after her daughters had retired, Margaret sat alone in Mrs. Fletcher's small garden. The knife Black Hawk had given her lay across her lap, its bone handle smooth beneath her fingers. The choices before her seemed simultaneously clear and impossibly complex. "Trouble sleeping?" Mrs. Fletcher asked, joining her on the bench. The older woman had proved remarkably perceptive during their stay, offering guidance without intrusion. "Troubled thinking," Margaret admitted. Mrs. Fletcher nodded knowingly. "You've been through more than most could bear. Yet here you sit, strong, enough to worry about choices rather than mere survival. That's a victory of sort." "I suppose it is," Margaret agreed, "but the path forward isn't as clear as I once thought." "Paths rarely are out here," Mrs. Fletcher observed. "The maps show routes between settlements, but they can't tell you which journey your heart needs to take." Margaret glanced at her sharply. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who stood at similar crossroads," the older woman replied with a gentle smile. "My Nathan was a fur trader when we met. My Boston family was scandalized when I chose a life that didn't include proper drawing rooms and calling cards." She gazed up at the star-filled sky. 30 years of frontier life, hard years, many of them, and never once did I regret choosing love over convention. "It's not that simple," Margaret protested weakly. "No, it never is," Mrs. Fletcher agreed, "especially with 4 daughters to consider. But children are remarkably adaptable and stronger than we often give them credit for." She patted Margaret's hand before rising. "Whatever you decide, make the choice that lets you sleep peacefully when you're my age." Alone again, Margaret weighed her options with new clarity. The practical choice, continuing to Prescott, offered security and conventional acceptance. Her daughters would have a proper home, educational opportunities, and the protection of family connections. It was the safe choice, the expected choice. The alternative meant embracing uncertainty. Returning to the trading post, to Black Hawk, would mean navigating cultural boundaries few white women dared cross. It would mean potential ostracism from her own society and lingering suspicion from his. It would mean building something entirely new from the ashes of her former life. Yet when she imagined that path, uncertain as it was, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Possibility. Not merely security or survival, but the chance for genuine connection, for a life defined by courage rather than convention. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Margaret reached a decision. Whether wisdom or folly, she couldn't yet say. But for the first time since leaving Boston, the path ahead felt true to the woman she had become. "I've made a decision," Margaret announced the following morning as her daughters gathered for breakfast in Mrs. Fletcher's dining room. The quiet determination in her voice drew their immediate attention. Elizabeth, always the most perceptive, set down her coffee cup. "You're not planning to continue to Uncle James, are you?" Margaret took a deep breath. "No, at least not immediately." A mixture of emotions crossed her daughters' faces: surprise, confusion, and in Rebecca's case, unmistakable hope. "We're going back to the trading post," Margaret continued, "to Black Hawk." Silence greeted her declaration, each girl processing this unexpected announcement according to her nature. Catherine, practical as always, was the first to respond. "How will we get there? Wilson has already departed for his next trading run. Captain Miller mentioned a missionary group heading toward Navajo territory tomorrow," Margaret explained. "Reverend Simmons and his wife are establishing a school near the eastern reservation boundary. They've agreed to take us as far as Pine Creek Crossing. From there, we can hire a guide to the trading post." "Does this mean—" Sarah hesitated, glancing at her sisters. "Are we going to live with the Navajo?" "Not exactly," Margaret replied, "but I need to speak with Black Hawk before making permanent plans. He sacrificed his most valuable possessions to secure our passage to Santa Fe. At minimum, we owe him the opportunity to reclaim his property." This wasn't the full truth, and Elizabeth's raised eyebrow suggested she recognized the omission. But Margaret wasn't prepared to articulate emotions she herself was still reconciling. "What about Uncle James?" Elizabeth asked. "He's expecting us." "I've written explaining our delay," Margaret assured her. "We're not abandoning that option entirely. We're simply exploring alternatives." Rebecca clutched her wooden horse, her small face illuminated with joy. "We'll see Mr. Blackhawk again, and Grandmother Morning Star?" "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret confirmed, her resolve strengthening at her youngest daughter's evident happiness. "Well," Catherine said pragmatically, "I did want to learn more about those medicinal plants Morning Star was showing me." Sarah nodded, slowly. "I have so many sketches I wanted to finish at the trading post." All eyes turned to Elizabeth, whose opinion carried significant weight among the sisters. The eldest Sullivan daughter maintained a thoughtful silence, studying her mother with an intensity that belied her 16 years. "This isn't just about repaying a debt, is it?" she finally asked. Margaret met her daughter's gaze directly. "No, it isn't." Elizabeth nodded, seemingly satisfied with this honest admission. "Then I support your decision, Mother. We all should." The matter settled with surprising ease. They spent the day preparing for departure. Mrs. Fletcher, though clearly surprised by Margaret's choice, provided practical assistance without judgment. "The frontier makes unconventional women of us all," she remarked as she helped Margaret pack. "Your Thomas Blackhawk seems an exceptional man, from everything you've told me." "He is," Margaret acknowledged, "though I'm not certain what he'll make of our return." "Only one way to find out," Mrs. Fletcher said with a knowing smile. "Courage doesn't always roar, my dear. Sometimes it's the quiet voice saying, 'I'll try again tomorrow.'" Captain Miller proved less understanding when Margaret informed him of their change in plans. "Mrs. Sullivan, I strongly advise against this course of action," he cautioned, his official demeanor slipping to reveal genuine concern. "The territories between here and the Navajo lands are unpredictable. The massacre you survived wasn't an isolated incident." "I appreciate your concern, Captain," Margaret replied firmly, "but Reverend Simmons assures me they travel this route regularly, without incident." Miller frowned. "Missionaries are afforded certain considerations by the tribes. Civilian women and children without military escort are viewed differently." He sighed, recognizing her determination. "At least allow me to provide you with additional ammunition for your revolver, and I insist you accept this letter of safe passage should you encounter any military patrols." The following dawn found the Sullivan family joining Reverend Simmons's modest caravan. The missionary and his wife, Earnest, educationally minded Bostonians welcomed them warmly, though with evident curiosity about their unusual destination. The Navajo are remarkably receptive to educational initiatives, Reverend Simmons explained, as their wagons creaked westward. Unlike some tribes, they recognize the value of incorporating certain aspects of our culture while maintaining their own traditions. Mrs. Simmons, a former schoolteacher with kind eyes and practical hands, took an immediate liking to the Sullivan girls. "You've raised remarkable daughters, Mrs. Sullivan. Such resilience after all you've endured." "They've surprised even me," Margaret admitted, watching Elizabeth help the wagon driver negotiate a difficult stretch of road while Catherine engaged the missionary's assistant in a detailed discussion of native botany. "Sometimes I think children reveal their true nature during hardship rather than ease." A profound observation, Mrs. Simmons agreed. "And what of this Thomas Black Hawk? Reverend Simmons mentioned he's of mixed heritage?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed, uncertain how much to reveal about their relationship. "His father was a respected trader, his mother Navajo. He bridges both worlds with remarkable grace, despite the challenges." "Such individuals are invaluable to our work," Mrs. Simmons noted. "Perhaps he might consider assisting at our school? We could offer fair compensation." Margaret smiled noncommittally, recognizing the well-intentioned but presumptuous nature of the suggestion. Black Hawk's path was his to determine, not hers to negotiate. The journey to Pine Creek Crossing proceeded without incident. True to Captain Miller's assessment, the missionary's wagon received respectful distance from the occasional native hunting parties they encountered. On the third day, they arrived at the small settlement that marked the boundary between territories. Little, more than a trading post, a livery stable, and a few scattered homesteads. "This is where we must part ways," Reverend Simmons announced. "We continue north from here, while your destination lies westward." The missionary provided Margaret with a letter of introduction to Red Rock Trading Post's proprietor, who could arrange their final transportation. His wife embraced each Sullivan daughter warmly, extracting promises of letters detailing their adventures. "Your path is unconventional," Mrs. Simmons whispered to Margaret during their farewell. "But I sense it's right for you. Trust that instinct." Red Rock Trading Post proved considerably rougher than Santa Fe's civilized establishments. A weathered log structure perched on the banks of a seasonal creek, it serviced trappers, prospectors, and the occasional government surveyor. Its proprietor, Jeremiah Hawkins, greeted Margaret's request with undisguised skepticism. "You want passage to Riverwalker's Trading Post?" he repeated incredulously. "Ma'am, that's 3 days through territory most white folks avoid deliberately." "We've traveled there before," Margaret stated firmly, "and we have friends among the Navajo." Hawkins raised bushy eyebrows. "Friends, is it? Well, that's a first." He studied the Sullivan women thoughtfully. "I've got a supply wagon heading that direction in 2 days. Driver's a half-Cherokee named Dawson, who knows those trails better than most. He can take you, but it'll cost." Margaret produced the funds Mrs. Fletcher had discreetly pressed upon her at their parting. "Will this suffice?" Hawkins counted the money with practiced efficiency. "It'll do. Wagon leaves at first light day after tomorrow. I can offer basic accommodations until then. Nothing fancy, mind you." Their quarters, a small back room with straw-filled mattresses, were indeed rudimentary compared to Mrs. Fletcher's comfortable boarding house. But after their experiences at Blackwater Canyon, the Sullivan women found little cause for complaint. They spent the intervening day restocking supplies and gathering information about conditions ahead. "Unusual drought this season," reported Dawson, the taciturn driver who would guide their final leg. His weathered face and silver-streaked hair suggested a man well acquainted with frontier hardships. "Might need to take the northern route if the usual waterholes are dry." "Will that delay us significantly?" Margaret asked. Dawson shrugged. "Day maybe 2. Better than dying of thirst. His eyes narrowed slightly. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Hawkins mentioned you're heading to River Walker's Post on account of friends. Would one of those friends happen to be Thomas Black Hawk? Margaret tensed. You know him. Known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, Dawson replied, his expression softening. His father pulled me through a nasty fever when no one else would touch a Cherokee. Good folks, the Franklins. He nodded decisively. We'll get you there safe. Any friend of Black Hawk's is worth the extra effort. They departed as promised at dawn. Dawson's wagon, loaded with trade goods and provisions, offered limited comfort but reliable transportation. The girls, having developed considerable stamina during their ordeal, alternated between riding and walking alongside. As the landscape gradually shifted from scattered pine forests to the open expanses of the high desert, Margaret found her anticipation growing. What would Black Hawk think of their return? What expectations had she created with this impulsive decision? The practical concerns she'd temporarily shelved in Santa Fe resurfaced with mounting urgency. On their second night, camped beneath a natural rock formation that provided shelter from the wind, Margaret confided her uncertainties to Elizabeth. Have I made a terrible mistake? She whispered as they sat apart from the others, dragging you girls back into this wilderness based on feelings I can barely define? Elizabeth, who had inherited her father's thoughtful nature alongside her, mother's determination, considered the question seriously. Do you remember what father used to say about crossroads? She finally asked. Margaret smiled at the unexpected reference. That the path that frightens you most is usually the one you need to take. Exactly, Elizabeth confirmed. Uncle James and Arizona represent safety and convention. Black Hawk and the Navajo lands represent uncertainty, but also possibility. She took her mother's hand. You taught us courage during the massacre and its aftermath. Now you're teaching us to honor our hearts alongside our heads. That's not a mistake. The wisdom in her daughter's response brought tears to Margaret's eyes. When had Elizabeth transformed from a child into this insightful young woman? When did you become so wise? She asked softly. Elizabeth smiled. Probably around the time you pulled me under that overturned wagon and showed me how to survive impossible odds. Their journey's final day brought them through increasingly familiar territory. Rebecca recognized landmarks from their previous passage, excitedly pointing out the mesa where River Walker's trading post nestled. By late afternoon, Dawson confirmed they would reach their destination before nightfall. Looks like you've got a welcoming committee, he observed, as they crested the final ridge overlooking the settlement. A small group had gathered in the central courtyard, alerted to their approach by the distant dust of their wagon. Margaret's heart raced as she strained to identify the figures below. She recognized River Walker's distinctive silver-streaked hair and Morning Star's dignified posture, but her eyes searched for one figure in particular. Is he there? Catherine asked, echoing her mother's unspoken question. I can't tell, Margaret admitted, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. As they approached the final bend in the trail, a lone rider appeared from a side canyon, moving rapidly to intercept their wagon. Margaret recognized Black Hawk's distinctive painted mare, the same horse he had traded for their passage to Santa Fe. He got his horse back, Rebecca exclaimed joyfully. Dawson slowed the wagon as Black Hawk approached. For a moment, he seemed unable to believe the evidence before his eyes. Then his normally impassive expression transformed into undisguised wonder. Margaret Sullivan, he said, her name itself a question. Thomas Black Hawk, she replied, a smile breaking through her nervousness. He guided his horse alongside the wagon, studying each Sullivan face as if confirming a dream's reality. You've returned, all of you. We have unfinished business, Margaret explained, suddenly conscious of Dawson's curious observation and her daughter's attentive presence. Understanding flickered in Black Hawk's eyes. Indeed we do. He turned to Dawson with newfound animation. "The trading post is prepared to receive your goods. River Walker mentioned you bring the medicine shipment." "That and more," Dawson confirmed, grinning, "including some unexpected passengers." Black Hawk rode ahead to announce their arrival, his straight-backed posture radiating an energy Margaret hadn't witnessed during their previous encounter. By the time their wagon reached the settlement, the entire community had assembled to greet them. Morning Star stepped forward, her weathered face creasing with genuine pleasure. "The Sullivan women returned to us," she announced in English for their benefit. "Our circle is completed." River Walker, though more reserved, inclined, his head respectfully. "You honor us with your trust, Margaret Sullivan. Few white women choose our company when safer paths exist." "Safety isn't always measured by familiar surroundings," Margaret replied, the words coming naturally despite her careful rehearsal of this moment. "Sometimes it's found in the character of those who stand beside you." Her gaze shifted to Black Hawk, who stood slightly apart, his eyes never leaving her face. The connection between them, tentative during their first encounter, had strengthened in absence, like metal tempered by fire. While the trading post community helped Dawson unload his wagon, Morning Star ushered the Sullivan women to her hogan. "You will stay with me tonight," she declared. "Tomorrow we will speak of what comes next." The girls, exhausted yet exhilarated by their arrival, quickly reintegrated into the rhythms of the settlement. Elizabeth joined several young women preparing the evening meal. Catherine resumed her study of medicinal plants with Morning Star. Sarah retrieved her sketchbook, eager to capture the sunset's effect on the mesa. Rebecca disappeared with several Navajo children who remembered her from their previous visit, her laughter drifting across the compound. Left momentarily alone, Margaret stepped outside Morning Star's dwelling. Black Hawk waited nearby, respectful of her need to settle her family, but clearly eager for private conversation. "Walk with me," he suggested, gesturing toward a narrow trail that wound behind the settlement. They followed the path in comfortable silence until reaching a natural outcropping that offered views across the valley. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold and crimson, transforming the harsh terrain into breathtaking beauty. "I never expected to see you again," Black Hawk finally said, his voice quiet but intense. "When Wilson brought news that you'd safely reached Santa Fe, I believed your journey would continue eastward without looking back." "That was the logical path," Margaret acknowledged. "My brother-in-law still expects us in Arizona. Captain Miller arranged a military escort. Everything was prepared for our departure, yet you returned." The simple statement contained a universe of questions. Margaret turned to face him directly. "I realized something in Santa Fe, something I couldn't ignore no matter how practical the alternatives seemed." "What realization?" Black Hawk asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. "That sometimes survival demands more than merely staying alive," Margaret replied. "Sometimes it requires the courage to follow an unexpected path." She took a deep breath. "I came back because our story didn't feel complete, because my daughters and I found something here we didn't anticipate, not just safety or kindness, but possibility." Black Hawk stepped closer, the last sunlight illuminating the hope and uncertainty in his expression. "What possibility do you see, Margaret Sullivan?" "The possibility of building something new," she said simply. "Something that honors both our pasts while creating a shared future. I don't know exactly what shape it might take, but I know it deserves exploration." He reached slowly for her hand, giving her every opportunity to withdraw. When their fingers intertwined, the contact felt simultaneously revolutionary and inevitable. "My grandmother has a saying," Black Hawk murmured. "When two rivers join, they create a new path together while carrying the essence of their sources." "Your grandmother is very wise," Margaret smiled. though I imagine she'll have practical questions about how a Boston widow and her 4 daughters might fit into this community. She already considers you family, Black Hawk assured her. As for practical matters, my father's trading post still stands near the southern boundary. It needs renovation, but with effort, it could serve as both home and livelihood. He hesitated, before adding, if that appeals to you. The invitation hovered between them, tentative yet profoundly significant. Not merely shelter, but partnership. Not merely survival, but shared purpose. I would need to learn much, Margaret acknowledged. About trading, about your mother's people, about building bridges between worlds. As would I, Black Hawk replied. About raising daughters, about Eastern perspectives, about creating a household that honors multiple traditions. His eyes held hers steadily. But I believe some lessons are worth the learning, Margaret Sullivan. As darkness settled over the mesa and distant cooking fires beckoned them back to the community, Margaret recognized the crossroads for what it was. Not an ending, but a beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Their unlikely bond forged in tragedy, but sustained by something far more powerful. The courage to imagine a future beyond the boundaries others had defined. Yes, she agreed simply, her hand tightening around his. Some lessons are definitely worth learning. 1 year later, the trading post at Whispering Pines Creek bore little resemblance to the abandoned structure Margaret had first glimpsed 12 months earlier. What had been a weathered shell of Thomas Franklin's original establishment now stood renewed, its log walls reinforced, its roof sound, its surroundings transformed from neglect to purposeful industry. Margaret paused in hanging, freshly laundered linens, to observe the activity around her. Near the corral, Black Hawk and Elizabeth worked with a spirited young stallion, their confident movements reflecting a partnership developed through months of shared labor. Catherine tended her meticulously organized herb garden, where traditional Navajo medicinal plants grew alongside Eastern varieties she'd special ordered from Santa Fe. Sarah sat beneath a cottonwood tree, sketching a group of Navajo children listening to Rebecca's animated storytelling, the youngest Sullivan daughter now switching effortlessly between English and Navajo phrases. A year ago, Margaret could never have imagined this life. Now, she couldn't imagine any other. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the trail leading from the main reservation. Riverwalker appeared, accompanied by 2 young Navajo men and a wagon loaded with wool blankets, silver jewelry, and pottery. "Thomas Black Hawk," Riverwalker called. "The trading caravan departs for Santa Fe tomorrow at dawn. Are you prepared?" Black Hawk acknowledged the headman with a raised hand before turning to complete his instructions to Elizabeth about the stallion. Their monthly trading expeditions had become the economic foundation of their unusual household. Black Hawk, transporting Navajo crafts to Santa Fe and returning with goods from the East that benefited both cultures. Margaret welcomed Riverwalker with the traditional Navajo greeting Morning Star had taught her. "The coffee is hot, and Catherine just finished baking bread," she added in English. Riverwalker's initial suspicion of their unconventional arrangement had gradually yielded to grudging respect and eventually genuine appreciation. "My wife sends these," he said, producing a package of dried berries and pine nuts. "She says Rebecca has acquired a taste for them." "Her kindness is appreciated," Margaret replied, accepting the gift. "Will you join us for the midday meal?" "Briefly," Riverwalker agreed. "We must return before nightfall. The tribal council meets tomorrow regarding the government agent's new proposals." The mention of government business cast a momentary shadow across Margaret's thoughts. The past year had brought increasing pressure from territorial authorities attempting to restrict native movements and cultural practices. Black Hawk's unique position Officially registered as a U.S. citizen through his father while maintaining deep connections to his Navajo heritage, had proven invaluable in navigating these complexities. Inside the trading post's main room, evidence of their blended existence surrounded them. The trading counter Thomas Franklin had built still dominated one wall, now restored and expanded. Navajo rugs warmed the plank floors, while Boston-made curtains framed the windows. Margaret's sewing machine, a miraculous arrival via freight, wagon 3 months earlier, occupied one corner, while traditional clay cooking vessels lined the hearth. Most revealing was the bookshelf Black Hawk had crafted from local pine. Alongside Thomas Franklin's Bible and survey maps rested volumes of Shakespeare that James Sullivan had sent from Arizona, botanical references Catherine studied religiously, and illustrated children's stories Morning Star had helped translate into Navajo for the reservation's developing school. As Riverwalker sampled Catherine's fresh bread and discussed trading prospects with Black Hawk, Margaret reflected on the journey that had led them here. The first months had been the hardest, rebuilding the trading post, establishing their unusual household, negotiating their place between cultures that historically viewed each other with suspicion. Her brother James had initially responded to news of her decision with dismay bordering on outrage. His letters expressed everything from concern for her safety to accusations of mental instability brought on by trauma. Only Elizabeth's careful correspondence detailing their progress, along with Margaret's firm but loving responses, had gradually convinced him to accept, if not entirely understand, her choice. Their most significant breakthrough had come 6 months earlier when James finally visited, arriving with a wagon loaded with family possessions he'd stored after selling their Boston home. His initial stiffness toward Black Hawk had dissolved during a 3-day hunting expedition where they'd been forced to rely on each other's skills to survive an unexpected blizzard. By his departure, James had extended an invitation for the entire family to visit his Prescott homestead, a recognition of their union that had meant more than any official documentation. The Army patrol reported Apache movement near Blackwater. "Canyon," Riverwalker was saying, drawing Margaret back to the present conversation. "Captain Miller advises avoiding that route for the next trading journey." Black Hawk nodded thoughtfully. "We'll take the Northern Passage. Adds a day but offers better water access regardless." The mention of Captain Miller highlighted another unexpected development in their unconventional life. The officer who had initially questioned Margaret's sanity in returning to Navajo territory had become a valuable ally. Recognizing Black Hawk's unique ability to bridge cultural gaps, Miller regularly sought his assistance in mediating disputes between settlers and native communities. These diplomatic missions, while occasionally dangerous, had established Black Hawk's reputation as a man of integrity, respected in both worlds. After the midday meal, Riverwalker's party departed for the reservation, laden with coffee, sugar, and metal tools secured through the trading post. Sarah and Rebecca accompanied them partway, planning to visit Morning Star, who had been teaching them traditional weaving techniques. Alone in the trading post with Black Hawk, Margaret took a rare moment of quiet companionship. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed in a year," she admitted as they sorted inventory for the upcoming Santa Fe journey. Black Hawk's expression softened as he regarded her. The reserved man who had rescued them at Blackwater Canyon had gradually revealed deeper dimensions, quiet humor, profound wisdom, and a capacity for tenderness that still surprised her. "When I found you beneath that overturned wagon," he said, "I was simply trying to balance the scales of justice, one good act to offset the violence I'd witnessed." He touched her hand gently. "I never imagined that single decision would transform both our lives so completely." Margaret entwined her fingers with his, the gesture now familiar and comforting. "Do you ever regret it, taking on a ready-made family with 4 opinionated daughters?" His laugh, once so rare, came more easily these days. Never, though I admit Elizabeth's determination to master every aspect of horse trading has tested my patience occasionally. She admires you tremendously, Margaret observed. All the girls do. And I them, Black Hawk replied simply. Each carries her own medicine, as my grandmother would say. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Jeremiah Walsh, the former wagon train guide whose warnings had gone unheeded before the Blackwater Canyon massacre, appeared in the doorway. His weathered face registered surprise upon recognizing Margaret. "Mrs. Sullivan," he asked incredulously. "They told me in Santa Fe you might be here, but I scarcely believed it." "Mr. Walsh," Margaret acknowledged, momentarily transported to that fateful day when his caution had been overruled by eager settlers. "You're a long way from the California Trail." Walsh removed his hat, revealing hair that had grown considerably grayer. "Gave up guiding after Blackwater Canyon. Couldn't face leading another family to their deaths." His gaze shifted between Margaret and Black Hawk, clearly attempting to comprehend their evident partnership. "When I heard survivors had been found, I started tracking the story. Needed to know if my warnings could have saved more lives." Black Hawk gestured for Walsh to be seated, offering him coffee with the hospitality that governed their home. "You tried to prevent the massacre," he stated, rather than asked. "River Walker told me of your meeting the night before." Walsh nodded, grimly. "Tried to convince them to delay, to find another route, but Finley and Porter had the others riled up about reaching the territories faster." He looked directly at Margaret. "I should have been more forceful, should have refused to proceed. Regardless of the vote, the responsibility wasn't yours alone," Margaret assured him, recognizing the burden of guilt he'd carried. "Each adult made their choice." "How did you survive?" Walsh asked. "The military recovery party found nothing but bodies and burned wagons." Margaret explained their salvation, the overturned wagon in the ravine, Black Hawk's discovery of their hiding place, their journey to the Navajo trading post, and the gradual evolution from rescue to partnership. Walsh listened in astonishment. "In all my years on the frontier, I've never heard a story quite like yours." He studied Black Hawk with newfound respect. Most men would have ridden away from such responsibility. Taking on a widow and 4 children crosses boundaries few dare to bridge. "Some boundaries exist only in our minds," Black Hawk replied, his arm resting comfortably across Margaret's shoulders. "Others are worth crossing when the heart recognizes its true path." Walsh stayed for dinner, meeting the Sullivan daughters upon their return and marveling at their adaptation to frontier life. Elizabeth's confident horsemanship, Catherine's extensive knowledge of native medicine, Sarah's artistic documentation of Navajo cultural practices, and Rebecca's effortless bilingualism clearly impressed the veteran guide. "You've built something remarkable here," he told Margaret before departing the following morning. "Something that gives me hope for the territory's future." After Walsh's departure, preparations for the Santa Fe trading expedition intensified. Unlike earlier journeys when Black Hawk had traveled alone, this trip would include Margaret and Elizabeth, their first significant absence from the trading post since establishing their home. "Are you certain Catherine can manage things here?" Margaret asked as they packed the wagon with carefully documented trade goods. At 15, Catherine had proven herself remarkably capable, but 3 weeks was the longest they'd left her in charge. "She has Morningstar visiting every other day, and Sarah is surprisingly practical despite her artistic nature," Black Hawk reminded her. "Besides, Wilson promised to check on them during his northern route." Elizabeth loaded the last bundle of blankets, her excitement evident. "Mother, we've discussed this extensively. Catherine practically runs the medicine trade already, and I need to observe the Santa Fe negotiations firsthand if I'm ever going to master this business." Margaret smiled at her eldest daughter's determination. Elizabeth had embraced frontier. Life with unexpected enthusiasm, her natural leadership finding perfect expression in the trading business. At 17, she already commanded respect from Navajo weavers and Santa Fe merchants alike. The night before their departure, as Margaret completed final preparations, she found Rebecca sitting alone on the trading post's porch, clutching the wooden horse Black Hawk had carved during their first journey together. "What troubles you, little one?" Margaret asked, though little one hardly applied anymore. At 8, Rebecca was growing rapidly, her once delicate constitution strengthened by outdoor living and Morning Star's herbal tonics. "When you first decided to return here instead of going to Uncle James," Rebecca began thoughtfully. "Were you afraid?" Margaret sat beside her youngest daughter. "Terrified," she admitted honestly. "It meant leaving everything familiar for something completely unknown." Rebecca nodded solemnly. "Sarah told me some children at the reservation school said our family doesn't truly belong anywhere, not in the white world or the Navajo world." Margaret felt a familiar ache at the reminder of the prejudices their unconventional family occasionally faced from both communities. "People often fear what they don't understand," she explained. "But belonging isn't about fitting perfectly into one world or another. It's about creating your own place and filling it with love." "Like our trading post," Rebecca suggested. "Exactly," Margaret agreed. "Look around you, Navajo rugs beside, Boston books, your father's Bible next to Morning Star's medicine bundles. We've created something new that honors both traditions without being limited by either." Rebecca considered this, running her fingers over the carved horse. "So we're like a new trail between two mountains." "A very wise way of putting it," Margaret affirmed, constantly amazed by her youngest daughter's insights. "Now, off to bed. We have an early start tomorrow." Later that night, Margaret found Black Hawk outside, checking the wagon's harnesses by lantern light. The domesticity of the moment struck her suddenly. How naturally they had fallen into partnership despite the cultural chasms they'd bridged. "Rebecca is worried about belonging," she told him, helping to secure a loosened strap, "about finding her place between worlds." Black Hawk nodded thoughtfully. "A feeling I know well. My father used to say that those who walk between worlds may have harder journeys, but see farther horizons." "Is that why you've agreed to Captain Miller's request to serve as interpreter at the Territorial Conference next month?" Margaret asked. The upcoming meeting between territorial officials and tribal leaders represented an unprecedented opportunity for peaceful negotiation, but also considerable risk for those involved. "Partly," Black Hawk acknowledged, "but mostly because our children deserve a future where their dual heritage is strength, not burden." He glanced toward the trading post where all 4 girls now slept. "Our children had long since replaced your daughters," in his speech, a transition so natural that neither had marked its exact occurrence. The following dawn brought their departure. The wagon loaded with trading goods, Elizabeth riding alongside on her own mare, Margaret sharing the bench with Black Hawk. Catherine, Sarah, and Rebecca stood in the doorway of the trading post, waving until the wagon disappeared around the bend. As they traveled the now familiar trail toward Santa Fe, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. From the tragedy at Blackwater Canyon had emerged an unlikely family forged through shared survival and mutual respect. Their trading post stood as physical testament to the possibility of bridging seemingly insurmountable divides, cultural, racial, historical. Challenges remained. Government policies grew increasingly restrictive toward native peoples. Some settlers viewed their mixed household with suspicion or outright hostility. Occasional Apache raids still threatened travelers in the territories. Even within the Navajo community, certain traditionalists questioned riverwalkers' acceptance of their unconventional arrangement. Yet for every obstacle, unexpected allies had emerged. Captain Miller's military reports consistently praised Black Hawk's diplomatic efforts. Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house had become their reliable base in Santa Fe, the proprietress proudly introducing them to influential territorial officials. Morning stars standing among the Navajo elders provided cultural legitimacy that proved invaluable during disputes. Most significant was the transformation within their family unit itself. Elizabeth had found her calling in the trading business, her natural intelligence flourishing in this practical application. Catherine's scientific mind had embraced both Western medicine and Navajo healing traditions, creating innovative treatments that drew patients from both communities. Sarah's artistic documentation of Navajo ceremonies and daily life had gained attention from anthropologists and preservationists in the East. And Rebecca, their once frail youngest, now moved confidently between cultures, her natural empathy making her a beloved figure among reservation children. As their wagon crested the ridge that provided the last view of their trading post before the trail dipped into the canyonlands, Margaret reached for Black Hawk's hand. "No regrets?" she asked softly, the question of a ritual between them during significant moments. He turned to her, the morning sun illuminating the face that had transformed from rescuer to partner, the eyes that had witnessed both unspeakable tragedy and unexpected joy. "No regrets," he confirmed, his voice carrying absolute certainty, "only gratitude for the path that brought us here." Margaret squeezed his hand, her gaze taking in Elizabeth riding proudly ahead and the distant trading post where their other daughters continued the life they'd built together. "Like braided rivers," she murmured, recalling Morningstar's description of their unlikely union. "Separate sources joining to create something stronger than either alone." Black Hawk smiled at the reference. "Exactly so. And who can say where such waters might eventually lead?" As their wagon continued toward Santa Fe, Margaret Sullivan, once a frightened Boston widow hiding beneath an overturned wagon, embraced the uncertainty with confidence. Their story had begun in massacre and desperation, but it would continue in hope and possibility, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and its capacity to find connection across even the most formidable divides. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not as survivors of tragedy, but as architects of a future where boundaries became bridges and different worlds found common ground in shared humanity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.